Thanks for staying us on the conversation. On the first half, we dealt with the African Peace Delegation over the weekend, its successes, challenges, and what are the expectations so far. Meanwhile, on our next discussion, the United Nations World Food Programme, WFP, recently announced suspension of food aid in Ethiopia due to extensive theft of donations. This decision came shortly after the United States declared a similar suspension. The suspension in Ethiopia is dire, with over 20 million people requiring food assistance. The primary causes of the crisis are the severe drought in the Horn of Africa, which is the worst in decades, and a 2-year conflict in northern Ethiopia, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties.
In response to these challenges, the World Food Programme has provided aid to 7 million individuals affected by this crisis. The United States has been the largest contributor of humanitarian assistance to Ethiopia, having provided $1.8 billion in 2022. Neither the World Food Programme nor the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, disclosed specific information about the diversion of aid that prompted the respective decisions. Now, joining us for this very important discussion, we have Emeritus Professor Mukesh Kapila of the University of Manchester and former senior UN official who joins us live from Geneva, Switzerland. We also have Sayum Berhe, member Tigray Diaspora Council, joins us from Virginia in the United States. Glad to have you, gentlemen, on the program.
Glad to be here.
Now, I'll start with you, Professor Kapila. You were the former head of the United Nations mission in Sudan. The United Nations World Food Programme and the United States government's international aid agency, USAID, both allege widespread food diversions as reasons for the suspension of food aid to Ethiopia. Can you tell us more about this supposed food diversions and its implication for the people of Ethiopia?
Well, as you have hinted, I'm afraid neither the government nor the donors, in this case Americans, have been entirely transparent or provided fuller information as to exactly what was diverted when and how much food aid is involved. But clearly, it must be extensive for the Americans to take this very serious step of actually cutting off food aid at a time when needs are in the highest. And in Tigray in the north, we have a situation that is as close to famine as you can get. I think the implication of this is that those who need the assistance most are being penalized for the sins being committed by those who should have been safeguarding the food supplies and supplying them. So I'm afraid this is a completely disgraceful way of reacting to what was, obviously one has to condemn the loss, diversion, or the theft of the food, but to penalize the hungry recipients is not the way to deal with the situation.
Okay, now, Professor Kapila, looking at the investigations, I mean, there's been a lot of investigations and allegations, and internal sources state that the food aid corruption scandal also involves the Ethiopian army and 8 regional governments, as well as high-ranking figures from the World Food Programme and USAID. These are very serious allegations. I believe we have Sayum with us, so I'm going to direct this question to you, Sayum. So what level of investigations has been done so far with these supposed allegations that have been made against both the Ethiopian government, Eritrean government, the World Food Programme, and even USAID?
Appreciate you. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not for me, right? Okay.
No, that's for you, Sayum. You can have it.
Okay. Okay. I really appreciate you giving enough attention to this. I caught just a minute of the honorable gentleman who said those who are suffering are the hungry civilian Tigrayans. Now, as far as investigation, I think there is an African saying, 2 elephants fight, the grass gets destroyed. The poor are suffering. Now, I think you are absolutely right. I think it's an embarrassment that all the way to the top, everywhere, has committed this, legally, I don't know, morally, crime against humanity, killing innocent people because you are stealing food. Couple of questions I want to throw at you. If there were media, international media allowed in Ethiopia, we would have known much, much more who did it, where, and when. Now, the Tigray administrative government have done an investigation, have already started arresting few individuals, but this is way, way beyond Tigray. Does Ethiopia really export wheat? Is it a wheat that was produced in Ethiopia or stolen from the international community? Does the world body itself, are they clean? Is the Ethiopian military, the elephant in the room, the Eritrean government clearly have stolen more than food. So there is a blame that can go everywhere, madam, and this is really shameful.
Okay, Sayum, what has been the reaction by the Ethiopian government to these allegations and, you know, the fact that food aid has been suspended? What has the Ethiopian government done so far?
I'm sorry to say I don't expect much from Ethiopian government because every time they are told you're making a mistake, they look for excuse. They lie. So they haven't even admitted. The Tigray government, on the other hand, admitted there were individuals who have done that, arrested them in Adigrat, in Tigray, in Western Tigray. They have started arresting people. The Ethiopian government will never admit to anything. A government that denies genocide, what do we expect? The Eritrean government will laugh at you. It's really pathetic, and it's a shame for Africa, to be very frank with you.
Now, I'd like to bring in Professor Kapila back into the conversation. Now, according to the United Nations Humanitarian Agency, about 20 million people, that makes up 16% of the 120 million Ethiopians depend on food aid. This is a huge number of people that are dependent on this food aid. Now, we talked about the effects of the suspension, but looking at the dynamics behind the scenes at the United Nations and USAID, they do know that, look, it's like Sayum said, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers, that this would have dire consequences on the people of Ethiopia. Do you think, you know, perhaps it's just a threat? Do you think they will have the mind to carry out this suspension, knowing that, look, these are that these people are wholly dependent on food aid, or they hope to strong arm the Ethiopian government into doing something so that, you know that they're serious about it? And are there any other alternatives left to mitigate this lack of food aid if they carry out this suspension?
Well, here's the dilemma. The quantity of aid stolen, and by the way, it is not just in food aid. We have the same thing with drugs and medicines, is so huge, it would just not be possible without the active connivance of the World Food Programme and the United Nations system. In other words, absolutely the Ethiopian government is responsible, and absolutely rogue elements in Tigray are also responsible. But a problem of this magnitude is not possible without the active connivance of the global United Nations system, including the World Food Programme. So what that means is that, quite honestly, it's very important that the accountability there that takes place as much as it does in terms of governments. Now, the problem is this: because the UN and the World Food Programme have a monopoly in terms of aid distribution, because the Ethiopian government does not allow other aid agencies to enter. Even the Red Cross, including ICRC, have had limited access. What that means is that donors who don't want to punish the poor, starving beneficiaries of the food aid, whether it is in Tigray or whether it is elsewhere in Ethiopia, the same issues apply. But what are they to do? Because the aid access is so limited, and it is monopolized by the UN system, and the UN system is the most corrupted of all, and the government will not allow others to enter. So it's a combination of this perfect storm that is further starving and killing and continuing the genocide in Tigray.
Now, Professor Kapila, I'll stay with you for a bit because Sayo mentioned something about exportation of grain in Ethiopia, and this was mentioned by the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. And there are a lot of accusations and allegations saying that this purported grains that has been exported is actually stolen from the WFP and USAID relief shipments. So, first of all, why would the Prime Minister make such a declaration? And what do you make of these allegations? How true can it be? And do you believe that Ethiopia is actually prone to this exportation of grain?
Well, I think if you have to look at the track record of this government over the last few years. You've had a man-made famine of biblical proportions taking place. You have had systematic restriction of assistance going on to the region, and you had every single indicator of a human welfare completely reversed in a large section of the country. In Tigray especially, but also in other areas because the whole country has suffered. Now, under those circumstances, where the government has been embarked on a war of attrition with no holds barred, and there is very little transparency about what's going on. I think the words of the leadership of the Ethiopian government are the last to be trusted. This government has robbed these people, killed these people, so I'm not at all surprised that it is stealing food from the mouths of the babes of its people.
Thank you, Professor Kapila. Now, Sayum, I want to ask you about the geography of Ethiopia and where this alleged theft has been going on. Is it just restricted to Tigray? And also the Eritreans, because I remember the South African, the Pretoria Peace Accords. Everybody shook hands, the war ended, but what's the status of Eritreans in Ethiopian territory? Have they withdrawn? What is the current situation of things, and how are they part of this theft of food aid?
Well, let me start. I'm from Tigray. I am also Europe, the area that is under Eritrea. I can talk to my family members, and the food aid, even if it was not stolen, would have never got to majority of the Europe people. I just want to start from an area I know so well, where I was born. The Eritreans are in full control of a huge area of Tigray. In northern part, half of Europe is under control, and even the area they don't control, they can launch missiles and heavy guns so people cannot get food. That's the number one. Eritreans have been stealing, for God's sake, forks and knives and plates. Why would they not steal? And they have been seen taking the international donation to Eritrea. The elephant in the room, Eritrea is in charge of decision-making in Addis Ababa even right now. Now, the food was stolen on the way from Djibouti, in Afar. The food was stolen in Amhara. Actually, the food that was stolen in Tigray is extremely low compared to everywhere else. So it's all over. Now, I don't have evidence of Ethiopian government selling wheat, but I think the past behavior is a good indication of somebody's future behavior. The Ethiopian government have real difficulty telling truth about anything.
Now, so you permit me to interrupt you at this point. For the sake of our viewers, a lot of people listening will want to understand why Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed would allow Isaias Afwerki and his forces to hold territory in an independent sovereign state of Ethiopia and commit atrocities against its own people in parts of Tigray. Was there any sort of accord or alliance formed, and why are there still ENDF boots on the ground in Ethiopian territory?
You know what? This is a question that we have been asking. It's really difficult to get an answer. I have few points. The only thing Eritrea and Ethiopian government have an agreement of is destroying Tigray. That's it. They have no other issue. Now, my country, the United States, have arm twisted them to have peace agreement. The Pretoria peace, as I came here and said before, cannot succeed because it's not, it's not being fulfilled because Eritrea is right in there. Number one, I don't think Ethiopia can actually kick Eritreans out. He has already taken their military armaments, and therefore Abiy probably is scared that he could come to Addis, number one. Number two, as long as Tigray leadership and people suffer, Abiy is comfortable. The only reason he made peace is so to get the money. That's it.
Okay, so I would like to stay on this conversation. I want another opinion, that's Professor Kapila, on this supposed peace agreement or the peace deal. We're seeing involvement with the Eritrean government and a situation where we thought that, with the peace deal in Pretoria last year, there would be sort of peace and food aid distribution to these areas. So from your own observation of the situation at hand, do you feel that Ethiopian president, or prime minister rather, Abiy Ahmed has been able to fulfill his promises and obligations to the Tigrayan government and bring peace to the region?
I think the peace agreement was flawed. It was a shotgun marriage out of desperation on all sides for different reasons. I think because there was no independent monitoring at that time, there was no a track for peace and justice that would be credible, that by the standards of many other peace agreements that I have been very much a part of and over many years of working, it was very clear that this wasn't a very sincere peace agreement. That's one thing. And secondly, the peace agreement never included Eritrea in the equation. So peace agreement with the co-aggressor Eritrea, without the co-aggressor Eritrea, is not worth the paper it has been written on. And let me add just one important factual point to the earlier contribution. Most of the food aid has been stolen in Ethiopia as opposed to in Tigray. Why? Because very little food was going into Tigray, even when WFP was supplying that. So whatever got stolen from Tigray was very small quantity because the people were starving. So it's important to appreciate that responsibility for this, the failed peace process, the stealing the food from people's mouths and robbing and starving people to death is very much part of a central strategy in Addis, which is supported by Eritrea. And the two of them have actually got a well-recognized, well-documented process of cooperation that is currently going on. Besides, the government in Addis is very weak because it has got other conflicts in Ethiopia that are also taking place. So in a sense, it's a sign of weakness in Addis that all this is happening.
Now, quickly, Professor Kapila, staying with you as a former United Nations senior official, they often tout the R2P responsibility to protect. That's why NATO and the United Nations were involved in Yugoslavia and Bosnia and also Libya to a certain extent. Now, what's the fate of ordinary Ethiopians, the desperate ones that need of food aid? When this suspension kicks in, where are they expected to get food from? And is the United Nations going to look to the other side and say, you know what, we've done what we've done?
Well, the responsibility to protect the paradigm in which actually I was involved in designing many years ago is largely dead through a combination of geopolitics. I call it responsibility to procrastinate. And R2P has never worked in recent years at least, if you like. And it has no place in Ethiopia simply because R2P requires the consent of the state for it to be followed. And of course, Addis is not going to give that. Now, to come to your existentialist question, what therefore happens to starving people wherever they are in Ethiopia, north, south, west, east? Well, the answer is that the suffering will get worse because there are no other channels of food supply. The Tigray is surrounded. There is a chaos and conflict going on in Sudan. In fact, Sudanese refugees are coming into Ethiopia trying to find refuge. And in the general mess in the Horn of Africa, Somalia is in a bad way. On the other side, I'm afraid God save the people of Ethiopia, including Tigray, because they are going to die in ever greater numbers because of the evil horror that has been committed upon them by the authorities in both Addis and Asmara.
Those are very serious situations we're seeing there. And I think the best thing I could just ask is, how best can this distribution aid be further strengthened and monitored? Because we need this food aid. We need humanitarian aid to meet the people in Tigray and other parts of Ethiopia. So in your own opinion, how do you think it can best be strengthened, the distribution aid or systems, so that this aid can get to the intended people, the people who need it most?
In my opinion, I think you can do nothing with the current system.
Who watches over the watchmen? Yes.
Sorry?
Who watches over the watchmen?
Well, that's one thing, and you have to have options because basically you should be able to provide aid through other organizations. There are many other organizations. Some of them are doing excellent work all over the world, including in that part of Africa and all over Africa. We should not be dependent on a few agencies, the United Nations system. However, the question is, how do we get more humanitarian agencies, neutral ones, or ones which are not going to rob the people into the country? And that depends on consent of the Ethiopian government, who is the one that is going to allow people in or not, in the current political dispensation that we are suffering from.
Now, finally, Professor Kapila, do you feel that with the dire situation that the WFP or USAID, I mean, you talked about the fact that we should look at more neutral humanitarian agencies. Do you feel that for the sake of the people, they should lift the suspension and allow aid to at least meet the people? What do you think should be the next step?
Well, it's a very, very good question. And, my kind of pragmatic response is, in poor countries, in corrupted countries, which is what Ethiopia, in war-torn countries like Ethiopia, diversion of aid is very, very common. Now, we simply have to accept that it's going to be stolen. But that doesn't mean that you stop supplying aid, because if some of that aid gets to some of the people who need them, then I think we might be doing some good. It's not a very satisfactory answer that I'm giving. And obviously, more aid being stolen from more aid being supplied feeds the capabilities of the corrupt parties and the warring parties. But quite honestly, there is a hierarchy of morality here. That is, if we can help some of the people, some of the time, with some aid getting through to them, then that is the moral road to follow. That's why I'm against USAID, withdrawing all aid going into Ethiopia. It's a very hard situation to be in. There ain't an easy answer to this. But penalizing the suffering people is not the answer to the current situation.
Thank you very much, Emeritus Professor Mikesh Kapila from the University of Manchester, a former United Nations senior official. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And also Seyum Berhe, member of the Tigray Diaspora Council, joining us live in Virginia in the United States. We do appreciate your insight and contribution to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.